Hi everybody, today we're going to do something different. I get a lot of questions via YouTube, Facebook, or through my website, and a lot of these questions are very nuanced, and it needs a lot of time and effort and needs me to go into detail some of these questions because some of these questions are quite great that you ask me, but it's very difficult for me to reply in just a simple YouTube comment. So I'm going to start creating video content to answer some of your questions, some of the great questions that I get. And if you want me to reply to some of your questions, maybe ask a question on YouTube or Facebook or something like this and put hashtag #AskJason, and I'll try to address most of them if I can. If they do make sense for me to address, then I will do that. So I want to do that today. But before we get into that, you probably noticed that there's a few new things laying around, and I have a few new projects on the horizon, which I'm excited about. You will see those in the future, in the not too distant future. And so that's something to get excited about, especially for myself. And another thing I wanted to address before I get into today's question is a lot of people ask me if I have a Patreon account. And yes, I do have a Patreon account. I have a Patreon link in all of my videos in the description and at the end of each video. So if you do enjoy my content and you want to support my work, then please head over to my Patreon account, and any small contribution is appreciated. As you see, I am always reinvesting in my work because my passion is to serve you guys and to teach you the authentic knowledge of the East. So it's a never-ending process. This work never ends, so I hope you all appreciate that. And if you want to support me, then head over to Patreon. And another thing I wanted to quickly address before we jump into this question is I've noticed in the last 28 days that when I have a look at my analytics on YouTube, that 93% of people are not subscribed to my channel who view my channel, so who view my videos. So it's very important that you subscribe and also like my videos. A lot of people ask me, Jason, why doesn't your work reach a wider audience on YouTube? I don't really know how YouTube works, and I don't want to get into any negative dialogue about why YouTube recommend such meaningless content on the platform. But if you want my work to reach a wider audience, the only way that can happen is by subscribing to my channel and also liking my content and sharing my content. And also make sure that you turn on all notifications for my channel. Make sure you hit that little bell and turn on all notifications for my channel so you don't miss a video. This is very important. So I hope you guys can do that. And if you do believe in my work and you do think that it should reach a wider audience, then all of that helps. Every little thing matters. So to the audience that I already have, thank you. Very grateful to have you all aboard. Now, enough of my gibbering. Let's get into the first question I wanted to talk about. This will probably take up the whole video. So this question is via my website, and it's from actually a patron of my work via my Patreon account, and it's from Daniel Raymond, Dan. And Dan's a longtime supporter of my channel. And very grateful, Dan, very grateful. Thank you for being around for all of these years. And his question is very nuanced, and it's something we can unpack together. It's not so clear cut. But anyway, this is what Dan has to say. Dan asks me, the other day I was walking down the alley. An injured rat was laying on the ground, unable to move, but still breathing and moving its eyes and jaw. I grew up on a farm, so it was just a natural reaction to get my shovel to decapitate it. When I walked up to the rat, I suddenly realized that what I was about to do. I also realized I hadn't listened deeply to myself or the rat or the universe. At that point, I wondered, what is the best... Sorry, Dan. Sorry, guys. At that point, I wondered what is best to act on. I decided that my initial idea was probably the purest, and I decapitated the rat. What would be a good guide in this situation or similar ones? Thank you for your advice, my friend. Thank you for thinking of me, Dan. Well, this is a difficult one to unpack. And there's a few different ways that we could look at this. And I'll probably look at it from a Taoist perspective and also a Jainist perspective. These are two very diametrically opposed views, especially on morality, considering especially Taoism is an amoral approach to the world, and Jainism is a very strictly moral system. And so let's have a look first what Dan's talking about here. So he naturally felt that he should decapitate the rat. The rat is suffering. Now, let's look at this. First of all, when we see the suffering of any being in the world, no matter if it's human or animal or whatever, we have a visceral reaction to stop that suffering in any way we can, because we don't want to see anyone suffer. Hence the whole evolution of Eastern philosophy is based on the end of suffering. And so Dan's reaction is just, in this instance, we could say, is that from his conditioning? He reacted from his conditioning, or is this a natural reaction? And from a Taoist perspective, it's only a natural reaction, because Dan is just reacting to the situation. He's trusting his gut reaction. His gut reaction here is, his visceral reaction is that I don't want to see suffering and I don't want this rat to suffer. It's almost like an act of kindness in a sense. And I know a lot of people out there who get triggered by these sorts of things, probably in the comment section already, and trolling, but please listen. From a Taoist perspective, Taoism is purely a natural methodology. So when we see the suffering of any being, we want to alleviate that suffering. And that is our visceral response to what we experience. So what Dan experienced here was a suffering rat, and he empathized with the suffering of this rat. And so his best course of action was to decapitate the rat. Now, people would say from a moral perspective, this is incorrect. But let's look at it deeper. I've got a story similar to this. Well, it's kind of similar. Back about 2010, I was living in Sydney for a year or two, and one of my good friends from England, he came over for a morning tea, and obviously, being me, we're talking about philosophy and deep Eastern concepts. And I had this just on the window. This spider had created this web, and I just let it do its thing for months, and he's just chilling, And one morning we're there, and then a fly gets stuck in the web. As nature unfolds, the spider is going to, capitalize on the situation and consume the fly. Now, my friend, he's a bit of a moralist, so he thought, what should we do in the situation? And he thought we should save the fly. And the fly's already stuck, mind you, in this web, and the spider has already started to wrap its web around it. And then my mate is trying to dislodge the fly from the web, puts it to the side. What's the end result? The fly dies anyway. The fly can't get out of the web, the fly dies, the spider doesn't get a meal. So, what do we learn here? We learn here, don't interfere with the course of nature. Human beings, because of our intellect, have a tendency to interfere with the course of nature. And if we can learn anything from Taoism, Taoism is specifically about not interfering with the course of nature and understanding that you are a part of nature as well. So, Dan's response was just his nature responding to nature itself. So, we're not looking at it from an intellectual, moral perspective here. We're looking at it from just a natural methodology, which is Taoism. And so everything within Taoism, from the way we eat, from the way we live our life is trying to accord with nature. It has no moral rules or principles. It has no ethical things that we should follow. We should just follow what is our nature, and in following our nature, that is the moral imperative, because we are just following our nature and everyone else is following their nature, and we don't need a set of rules to warp our nature. Now, we could unpack that even more. I unpack that in a lot of videos, so I'm not going to go deep into that here. We're just talking specifically about this question. And so a lot of people may disagree with Dan's course of action, and this is where Jainism comes in. So if we look at it from a Jainist perspective, right, Jainism is, a wonderful tradition. I love Jainism, and I know many Jains in India, and one of the core principles of Jainism is ahimsa. Now, when we think about ahimsa, a lot of people think about veganism or vegetarianism, and look, that's a small component of ahimsa, and I know that's probably going to get a lot of vegans and vegetarians bent out of shape, but that's the reality. So ahimsa specifically means non-harming, and more to the point, not just physical non-harming, but mental non-harming, which a lot of the harming in the world is mental, which a lot of people don't consider. So from a Jainist perspective, if we look at it from the ahimsa perspective, their moral view here is that maybe the best course of action is just to let the rat suffer and die, and you, in some sense, not interfere with its dying process, which kind of contradicts a little bit what Taoism is saying, because I guess we could say from a perspective, if Taoism is about not interfering with anything or not interfering with nature, then we should just let the rat die slowly and suffer. Though that's getting away from the point of what is natural within our response as well. But that's another story. But so from a Jainist perspective, they would think that we should just sit back and let the rat die slowly. And in certain situations, this perspective of ahimsa does work. But does it work in this situation? Does it work in a situation where someone is suffering and it's probably best to alleviate that suffering? We've all, probably not all of us, but we've all experienced some of our loved ones suffering. Both of my parents died from cancer, and I witnessed the suffering of both of them. And I can tell you that after they both died, though I was extremely sad, there was a sense of relief that they didn't have to suffer anymore. And now, I know a lot of people who haven't lost any loved ones say that that's, they can't understand that because they haven't experienced it. But people who have had loved ones and they have lost them, they do understand that it's, in some sense, it's a relief that they don't have to suffer anymore, even though we will miss them dearly. So this is similar to this situation. And, a lot of people, because, a lot of people think that humans are on a pedestal and a rat is lower than a human. From a Taoist perspective, everything matters. So even a rat's life matters. So when we identify with the suffering of a rat, which Dan has, which means, this says a lot about Dan himself. He's got a very pure heart. We want to alleviate the suffering of all beings. This is the whole idea of the Bodhisattva principle in Buddhism, the alleviation of suffering of all beings, and hopefully the eventual enlightenment of all beings. Though we may look at the world right now and say, well, that's pretty far off. But nevertheless, that is the Bodhisattva principle. Maybe Dan's a Bodhisattva, we don't know. So when we look at it from both of those perspectives, we do see that, yes, what is our moral obligation in this experience? And I always side with the Taoist perspective on this, because nature has its own way. And I know that from an intellectual perspective, a lot of people disagree with that. Like, for example, if we look at vegans, right? Vegans disagree with certain cultures who eat meat, but their only resource is meat in certain cultures. And so that's how they get their nutrition and their protein. And so when we look at that from a natural perspective, that's just natural. They live in an environment where the main source of food is meat. But when we look at it from an intellectual perspective and we put our moral cap on and we pretend we are all pious, like a lot of this, what do we call it, the social justice warrior generation, then we, condemn people for eating meat and such things like that, even though we don't take into consideration the culture they are from or the part of the planet that they live on. So if we can take our intellectual and moral cap off, then we can just see nature for what it is, you know what I mean? We can just see that nature has its ways, doing its thing, and it's beyond our intellectual understanding. It's doing its thing, A lot of people get confused, especially religious people or people who are bound by dogma might say, why did this happen? Why, damn you, God, and this and that. And this is where Taoism becomes actually an elite spiritual path, in some sense, over some religions, because it's not saying that there is an all-governing Lord judging our every move. It's saying that there is a way of nature, and then you need to understand that way of nature and also come into accord with that way of nature. And, I've explained that in a lot of my videos and books, so I'm not going to get into that here. But we need to understand that. And so in this perspective, Dan has just followed his nature, and he has done what he needed to do. And I don't think that you should ever doubt in some sense, your gut response to certain situations like this, especially when we see suffering. We only tend to doubt our initial instinctual reactions, our gut reactions to certain situations, when we start to think with a moralistic head and an intellectual head. And a lot of that, especially in the West, is influenced by Christian indoctrination, where we have this idea of being super pious and super moral. But in a lot of cases, when we see people who are pious and moral on the surface, they are usually the opposite. And that's a big problem we have in the world. So Taoism undercuts that, and it supersedes that. And you're just following the best course of action without considering or thinking that I'm going to be judged harshly for this. And, people might think of karma or residual karma, and they might think that they might accumulate any karma because of these actions. And this is not really true. Karma is not a system based on human moral obligations. It's based on nature. And that's something that we need to understand deeply, because, karma is a natural system and not a moral system. We often project our own moral imperatives, which are based in some sense on a lot of religions like Christianity, onto nature. And nature is doing something different. As I keep telling you, nature is continually doing something different. So Dan, being part of nature, has, as a higher level of consciousness in nature, assumed his role in this moment and has been very compassionate to the rat and ended its suffering. Where the rat is now, that's another thing to get into. So that's my view on Dan's question. I hope that kind of answers it a bit, Dan. It's a bit long-winded, but there's a lot to go into. And look, I know a lot of people will get in the comments, and a lot of people are very emotional and triggered these days, and they might say, well, what about, our moral imperative in this moment? Maybe we could take the rat to the vet and this and that. But we can't discount that Dan grew up on a farm. He probably knows better than a lot of us city folk what to do in this situation. I mean, I grew up close to a farm. I didn't essentially grow up on a farm. So I would trust Dan's instincts in this situation because he's been a lot closer to nature and animals than probably a lot of us listening to this video. So we can't discount that as well. So we need to be very mindful that a lot of these questions, especially with Eastern philosophy, can be difficult to answer concisely because, you know, the world isn't black and white. It's shades of gray. And that's what we need to understand. And that's what traditions such as Taoism appreciate. They appreciate the gray, and they know that this game of black and white is not real. And we need to understand that from an impartial perspective, nature is doing its own thing. You're a part of that. And we only begin to suffer when we bring partiality into our consciousness. And that's usually how we're all trained. So Dan, growing up on a farm, he's much more closer to nature. He knows the game of black and white is false and that partiality has its own flaws. Though it's necessary, don't get me wrong, partiality can be necessary, but it's not the nature of existence. The nature of existence is impartial, and that's the nature of the sage's mind. That's the difference between a sage and us common folk. So that's also something for us to think about. So Dan, I hope I answered your question. I hope I unpacked it as much as I could. And remember, guys, as I said, if you have a question for me, send it off. And, some questions I can unpack in depth like this. Dan's question is, it's pretty nuanced and long-winded to some degree. And so it takes a lot of time for me to answer. And so hope you guys enjoyed. And I'm excited to share all the new content with you guys very soon. A lot of these new projects coming up, new documentaries on the way too. And so I hope you're all doing well out there. Hope you're all staying fit and healthy. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Shanti, shanti, shanti.